Food began arriving in factories, not from farms. It quietly entered the weekly grocery routine. The effects would emerge far beyond the kitchen. This was not a single change, but a slow, quiet shift in everything. What had been made in kitchens was now arriving in boxes. What had required time was now instant. What had been prepared was now assembled. And most people didn't think of it as a loss. The shift didn't begin with an announcement. It began with convenience, with the promise that time could be saved, that effort could be reduced, that modern life demanded modern solutions. And in the years following World War II, when industrial capacity was vast and distribution networks were already in place, the infrastructure for mass-produced food was simply repurposed. Factories that had made rations now made breakfast. Supply chains that had fed soldiers now fed suburbs. The machinery was ready. The logistics were tested. All that remained was to make it normal. And it became normal quickly, faster than most structural changes in how people live, faster than shifts in housing, transportation, or labor. Within 15 years, the majority of what filled grocery stores had been redesigned for shelf stability, not seasonality, for transport, not taste, for scale, not variation. The language around it shifted too. Homemade became a qualifier, not a default. Fresh became a marketing term, not a description of time. Natural became something that needed to be stated because the assumption had reversed. But this wasn't the result of consumer demand. It was the result of economic architecture, of decisions made not by families, but by corporations with access to capital, shelf space, and advertising. Decisions that prioritized growth over nourishment, consistency over complexity, profit margin over preparation. And because those decisions were made quietly in boardrooms and processing plants and distribution meetings, they didn't feel like decisions at all. They felt like progress. Most people never noticed this at the time. The early products were subtle. A cake mix that only required an egg. A soup that only required water. A dinner that only required heat. These weren't presented as replacements. They were presented as options, as tools, as help. And in a culture that increasingly measured worth by productivity, saving time in the kitchen didn't feel like surrender. It felt like efficiency. It felt modern. It felt like what everyone else was already doing. And that's how it spread. Not through coercion, but through repetition. Through advertising that showed smiling families. Through grocers who stocked more boxes than produce. Through neighbors who served the same brands. Through schools that taught home economics using processed ingredients. Through doctors who didn't yet connect diet to the chronic conditions that would appear decades later. The system didn't force anyone. It simply made the alternative harder to see. By the 1970s, the average American household spent less time preparing food than at any point in recorded history. Not because people were lazier, but because the infrastructure had been built to make speed the standard. Microwaves became common. Freezers became larger. Packaging became more convenient. And the food inside became more engineered, more shelf-stable, more consistent in texture, flavor, and appearance, regardless of season or region. Industrial food had become the default, and anything else required intention. The real impact appeared years later. Not in the immediate sense, not in a way that could be traced to a single meal or a single product, but in patterns. In the gradual rise of conditions that had been rare a generation earlier. In the way bodies that had been fed one way for millennia were now being fed another. In the way children grew up without tasting food that didn't come from a factory. In the way hunger and fullness stopped being reliable signals because the food had been designed to override them. But by the time these patterns became visible, the infrastructure was entrenched. The factories were built, the supply chains were locked in, the advertising budgets were enormous, the political influence was established. And reversing it would have required dismantling not just products, but entire economic systems. Systems that employed millions, that generated billions, that had become woven into the identity of progress itself. This wasn't the result of ignorance. The science existed. Nutritionists had raised concerns. Independent researchers had published findings. But those voices were drowned out by the voices with more reach, with more funding, with more access to the channels that shaped public perception. And so the concerns were framed as fringe, as anti-progress, as nostalgia for a past that had been worse in other ways. The message was clear. Questioning industrial food was questioning modernity itself. And most people didn't have the time or the tools to question it, because the same forces that had changed food had also changed work, had changed cities, had changed the structure of daily life in ways that made cooking from scratch not just inconvenient, but often impossible. Two-income households became necessary, not optional. Commutes became longer, childcare became more complex, and the time that might have gone to preparing food went elsewhere because it had to. This was structural. This was systemic. This was designed for scale, not people. The companies that made this shift possible weren't malicious. They were doing what companies do, optimizing for profit, expanding market share, reducing costs, increasing shelf life. They hired food scientists to make products more appealing, chemists to make them more stable, marketers to make them more desirable, and lobbyists to make sure regulations didn't slow them down. They operated within the logic of their incentives, and that logic had nothing to do with long-term health. The government didn't stop it. In many cases, it enabled it. Subsidies went to crops that fed factories, not people. Corn, soy, wheat, not vegetables, not fruit, not diversity. The policies weren't designed around nutrition. They were designed around volume, around keeping prices low, around feeding a population that was growing, urbanizing, and working more hours than ever before. And in that context, industrial food seemed like the solution, not the problem. By the 1980s, the transformation was complete. Grocery stores had become warehouses for packaged goods. Restaurants had become assembly lines. School lunches had become contracts with distributors. And the idea that food should be grown, harvested, prepared, and eaten within a short window of time had become quaint, old-fashioned, impractical. The average meal now traveled over 1,000 miles before being consumed. The average ingredient list contained substances that didn't exist a century earlier, and the average person had no idea what most of those substances were, because knowing wasn't required. Trust was. But that trust wasn't earned, it was assumed. Assumed because the system was too large to question, too embedded to avoid, too normalized to see as anything other than the way things were. And so it continued, year after year, decade after decade, with each generation further removed from the memory of what food had been before it was industrialized, before it was optimized, before it was scaled. Some people began to notice, not many, but enough. Enough to start asking why chronic illness was rising, why children were sicker, why obesity was climbing, why diabetes was becoming common, why allergies were multiplying, why autoimmune conditions were appearing in populations that had rarely seen them before. And when they looked for answers, they found patterns. Patterns that pointed back to what had changed, to what had been introduced, to what had replaced real food. But pointing this out carried risk, because it challenged not just products, but entire industries, not just habits, but entire economies. And so those who raised concerns were met with resistance, with deflection, with accusations of fear-mongering, with funded studies that contradicted independent research, with PR campaigns that framed doubt as ignorance. The system defended itself, not with truth, but with resources. And this is where the weight of it sits, not in any single decision, not in any single product, but in the accumulation of choices made by people who didn't have full information, who trusted institutions that had been captured by interests that didn't prioritize health, who were told that what was convenient was also safe, that what was affordable was also nourishing, that what was modern was also better. It wasn't. And the evidence didn't appear immediately. It appeared slowly, across populations, across decades, in ways that were hard to trace to a single cause, because the causes were everywhere. In the breakfast cereal, in the snack aisle, in the frozen section, in the condiments, in the bread, in the beverages, in the things that seemed harmless because they were small, because they were normal, because everyone else was eating them too. But normal doesn't mean safe, and widespread doesn't mean right. The infrastructure that enabled this transformation is still in place. The incentives haven't changed. The subsidies still flow to the same crops. The regulatory agencies still have ties to the industries they're meant to oversee. The advertising still uses the same emotional appeals. The products still line the same shelves. And the consequences are still unfolding in bodies that are now 2, 3, 4 generations removed from what their ancestors ate. This wasn't inevitable. It was chosen, not by individuals, but by systems that valued efficiency over health, growth over sustainability, short-term profit over long-term consequence. And those systems didn't ask permission. They simply built the world they wanted and then convinced people it was the only world possible. And this wasn't the only change.